Right. What time is it?
Turning over. 10:27.
10:29.
We're doing very well, yes.
Yeah, we've got half hour, then we can...
We've got a bit more, yeah.
Okay.
Go on.
So yeah.
What did you want to... You're going to ask me questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Recently, I got sent an article by a third party that said, "Is this your friend Stephen?" And it was on the Daily Mail,
Yes.
saying about the 48 Club, how
Yeah.
it's a front for spies, and
Yeah.
that was it.
Yeah.
In the past, we've spoken about it, where you said you got quite used to it,
Yeah.
with the American Cattle Association, how
Yeah.
you farmer. So what was your first impression that your family was being taken as being spies?
Oh, that goes back to...
Just to me? Yeah, whatever.
do you want me to talk to you?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I think when I was 4 or 5 years old, I'd met up with some boys who lived in the same street as me. I think tobogganing or playing football, whatever it was. And they'd invited me to go back to their house. And when we got back to their house, it was 2 American boys. When we got back to their house, there was a strange look on their mother's face when they told her who I was. And bit by bit, it took a bit of time for me to realise that as Americans in London, who knows what his dad's real job was, they didn't want to have anything to do with my dad and mum because they were considered to be communists. And they wouldn't talk to each other. There was one family who was a major in the army, the British Army. They used to talk to him, and he used to talk to my mum and dad, but they didn't used to talk to each other. And it was all about the Berlin Wall and stuff like that. And I never quite understood why people got so exercised about differences in political systems and ideas. Didn't really matter much to me because I was just interested in playing football. That was my life. As I began to get into my early teenage years, I began to understand the depth of the suspicion around us. And I suppose that comes from something to do with my father getting involved with China, and it was with Russia as well. But it comes from what happened in the East End of London when Jewish people were attacked for being Jews by the black shirts. And it was very violent and very horrible.
Battle of Cable Street.
And ended up with the Battle of Cable Street, but the important thing was that the young, my dad and his friends would go once a week to the town hall to have a bath and hang out, and sometimes they get attacked and sometimes they wouldn't. They used to get attacked in the streets by people with staves and all sorts of things. It was very nasty. And the rabbis wouldn't help. The Jewish religion didn't do anything to defend these young boys. And the Communist Party, which was organising then in the slipstream of the Great Depression and so on, because where they lived was very poor, they came to the help of the young Jewish people and helped them organise. And when the black shirts organised rallies, the Communist Party and the Jewish people went together to fight them, to drive them out of the area. And that led to the Great Battle of Cable Street. And at the Great Battle of Cable Street, the story is not very well known, but of course the communists turned out, and there was a large section of them in the population at that time because of the terrible conditions that they lived in these areas of the cities, and also because of the concern as a result of the depression and so on, that people were looking for alternative systems, which never happened. They never turned to communism in large numbers. But there was a lot of people went to Cable Street to stop the fascists marching through. And the police were at the front with the horses and tried to drive away through the wedges. And there was one group in addition to those two that were there, and that was the Dockers Union. And I went to a talk once about Cable Street, and somebody asked the man who'd done all the research, why were the Dockers there? He said, oh, it's in the book. In 1879, the Dockers went on strike, and they had very little sympathy from any other union except the Stepney Textile Workers Union, who sent them 7 and 6pence. And they never forgot that the only people who helped them when they were in trouble was the Jewish workers. And so when this happened in the East End of London, they came out, and the wives of the dockers were on top of the buildings throwing hot water over the fascists. The men were down in the streets fighting. So it was that's the background to it. And when my father was asked if he wanted to do something with China and Russia, he was very impressed that during the Second World War, the amount of casualties that the Russians had, 20 million, and felt that we owed them something rather than have a Cold War with them. So when he was asked to try and build trade with Russia and China, he worked with both for a while, but eventually gave up Russia because he felt that they had agendas that the Chinese didn't have. So he stayed with the Chinese. But you're talking about the early 50s when there was boycotts and sanctions on China, and it was considered to be wrong, evil, to have anything to do with China. The sorts of things being said about China then in the Houses of Parliament is being said today as well. Irrational, inappropriate, racist comments about the Chinese people, which meant that my father was viewed as being part of that in the way that I am. There are people today who won't talk to me because they think I support an evil regime. I have an interest in an evil regime, but I don't think that they are an evil regime. And I think we've all got shortcomings, and I think whatever these issues are that concern people are best worked out across tables and not on the basis of producing thugs in the streets of London and other cities today attacking anybody who looks remotely Chinese. Asians from all over Asia are being beaten up in our streets. The police are doing a good job of trying to stop it, but we live in a world where there are nasty people. That's happening again. I haven't been attacked myself, but I had one visit to my front door. That's enough.
I mean, it's always... your father wasn't particularly... Well, he wasn't religious. You're not religious.
Yeah. He was. He was
religious.
Oh yeah, he was in his synagogue choir. He was a very, his mother and father came from the Eastern Europe. The language that they spoke was Yiddish, which is a German version of Hebrew. And their lives were around the synagogue. That's what he grew up with. It was only when all this happened with the black shirts that he gave up religion. He just said that I don't believe there's a God. He doesn't help us. He's not here. And because of his meeting with the communists, he read Karl Marx. I mean, unlike me, he understood it. I remember him trying to explain Karl Marx to me.
But yeah, he went on and made women's fashions.
Yeah.
CNA. Famously, actually, anti-Semitic.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So,
I remember
he wasn't a communist.
Somebody said to my dad once, how can you be a communist and rich and live like this? And my father said, where did Marx say you can't be rich? It's one of the great introductions by China of socialism, that socialism isn't making the rich poor, it's about making the poor rich. But that wasn't actually part of my father's plan. He just thought, well, I want to have a good life for my family. And he got out of the East End and lived in North London in a nice house, semi-detached, but nice house. And we went on holidays when possible, when he had enough money, to nice places. So was he a communist? No, I think he understood communism very well. He could talk about it with any level of people about it, but he didn't try and foment revolution. I think he used to support left-wing groups and try and help them, but he loved his family, liked his work.
But then when you went to university, you were branded a Marxist spy.
Not a Marxist spy, I was branded a Maoist. You have to remember, when I went to university, it was at the height of the Vietnam War protests. And I'm quite sure that the police had files on everybody who was involved in any significant way in those Vietnam rallies. I wasn't a major person, but I went to them. I didn't fight, I'm not a fighter, that's not part of me. By the time I got to university, it was clear in the first few weeks that I was part of the left-wing group, and it was from that group that I became the first student representative on the college council, and I had to go and represent the student body with a motion that they passed, which I had nothing to do with, which was to ask for two of the governors to resign because of their connections with of their companies with the apartheid regime in South Africa. So the Board of Governors met. It was the first time I'd ever been to it. It was the first time the students had ever been to it. And at the end of it, on the way, the president said, why don't you deal with the motion and I'll deal with the other stuff. I'm prepared. And he set me up. So it comes to any other business. And they said, is there any other business? And I said, yes, actually there is. The Students' Union has voted. At that point, there was banging on the door, and some of the students who'd organised the vote. And the provost said, I think we better deal with this rather quickly. What is it you want to say? I said, well, what they're knocking about is they've just passed a motion saying that these two gentlemen, Mr. Gates and Playfair, should resign because of the connections of Glaxo and Barclays in South Africa. And he said, well, I don't think we'll do that, will we? And let's call the meeting ended, and everybody went out the back door. And on the way out, somebody, I can't remember who, came up to me and said to me, do you know who they are? So I said, no. He said, do you know who the provost is? So I said, no. He said, well, the provost was the head of MI5. And the two men whose resignation you've called for are the former head of MI5 and MI6. So, you couldn't have put your foot in it in a bigger way. The next day, the head of the college sent a letter to all professors saying that I had organised a motion in the Students' Union to call for the removal of Gates and Playfair, and that this was guilt by association, the McCarthy technique, and that I was to be, viewed negative. Oh, I can't remember what exactly he wrote, but anyway, not very nice. I didn't take a lot of notice of it. We had a student newspaper called Pi, and one of the people who wrote on it, a friend of mine called Ken Follett, the author, and he sat down and went over the whole thing with me, and he said, so you didn't have anything to do with the motion? I said, no. He said, do you support the motion? So I said, well, I'm completely opposed to apartheid. I don't buy anything South African, but I don't know anything about these two gentlemen and what their connections are with South Africa, so I didn't feel a great sense of commitment to the motion. But I was mandated to do what I did. That's my job. So I only did my job. He wrote this wonderful 2-page spread attacking the provost for operating guilt by association at me. And of course the provost realised he'd made a terrible mistake in fingering me to all the professors. So he had to write a note to all the professors saying that he'd made a mistake and that I had nothing to do with the motion. I was just doing my democratic duty, and there should be no recriminations against me. And the tutor called me in for the second year, the second time. He called me in, the tutor of the law faculty called me in and said, I've just had a letter from the provost. What is it about you? Because in the first year, I'd been to a sit-in at the London Students' Union because the LSE students had occupied it because they'd all been thrown out of the LSE. I went there to try and meet some girls. Anyway, I was chased out of the place by the rugby students, and the next morning my Roman professor of Roman law, as I was leaving the lecture, pushed me up against a wall and said, we know who you are, you're finished. I thought he was drunk or something, I have no idea, I just ignored it. 3 or 4 days later, the tutor called me in and said, the law faculty has met to consider what happened for you with that professor. And I suddenly thought to myself, I've only been here 4 weeks and I'm in trouble. I'm going to get thrown out. And he said, he's quite a well-known, not very well-known, but he's a brilliant jurisprudence man, Ian Kennedy, Sir Ian Kennedy. He does all the MP's expenses and did the Bristol inquiry. And he said to me, the law faculty has met to consider what happened, and I have to tell you that I thought, this is it. 4 weeks and I'm out. And he said, I have to tell you that there will be no recriminations against you in your exams. Your politics are a matter for you, and we have no wish to interfere in your politics, and what was said to you was inappropriate. I said, he said, do you understand? And I said, no, I don't. So he said, when we took you in, the professor who took you in, the Dean of Students, sent you down to see me and rang me and said he thought that I was somebody interesting to have in the faculty. And after I had interviewed you, I rang him back and I said, I think he's thick as 2 bricks. And he said, I think you are thick as 2 bricks. You can't fail your exams this summer go and have a good year. That's what I just said to you. So when this all happened with the provost in South Africa, he called me in again and he said, I've just received this letter from the provost and it says I'm not to have recriminations against you for what he wrote. What did he write? And I told him. He said, oh, well, we can't have any recriminations against you. And I said, what does that mean? He said, you're so thick. He said, it means you can't fail your second year exams. Go have a good time. So I got through 2 years of exams by the misunderstanding. Anyway, that's not what you asked me about.
But but afterwards, I mean, it has been quite
Yeah.
quite serious.
Yes.
You've got
Yeah.
used to it and
Yeah.
you've made fun of it.
Yeah,
But
it's true.
you've been branded a spy
Yeah.
for.
The college organised 56 candidates against me when I stood for president. That's how mental they were about me. They thought that I was the beginning of some major sit-ins and protests that was going to take over. I think they thought that the protests that happened across the universities in 68, 69, 70 were an infection. I don't think they understood that they represented discontent among students. They were bored, they were fed up. They didn't like tutored lecturers who didn't really try to teach. It was an important transitionary moment in our society. And I happened to identify with that. And I got elected, despite all these candidates they ran against me, I got elected with the biggest majority ever to be president of the Students' Union. And the provost went for me non-stop. He kept on trying to undermine me and all sorts of things. But I didn't take a lot of notice of it because I had my friends and I had my life and didn't really mean a great deal. And then I went to work with my father, and that was where I came across it. I really understood that the hatred from the Hongs in Hong Kong and from parts of the government structure. Sorry.
Did your father say to you, because I remember one of the films we did recently last year, where you said your father did say to you, you will be taken for a spy, you'll be accused of being a spy. When did your father sit you down and say, look, what we're doing is different? Or did your father actually think it was different? He just carried on his course?
There was an underlying knowledge in the home, in the family, that my father was on the left, that he had friends that and associates that were different from other people, because he didn't mix in the Jewish community. He mixed in he used to play bridge, he used to play golf, and he would have these meetings where he would talk about Marxism with Marxists. There was a guy called Reg Birch, who was head of one of the trade unions, was a Marxist-Leninist communist. There was a magazine that he helped found called Marxism Today, because he was interested in it all. But we knew that there were a lot of people who didn't like him. We were told that in our community around us, there are a lot of Jewish people who didn't like him. The rabbi used to preach against him. He'd say, people like him who do business with China, they are undermining the democratic societies that we believe in. And so I was aware of it, but it didn't interfere with my life. So when I went to work with my father in the summers, it didn't come up there. But when I started to work in the office and when I had my year between school and university, I was aware then of that doing business with China was considered by some people to be you shouldn't do it. These are communists, and as I got to know the Chinese, well, of course, a lot of them were nice to me because that was their job to be nice. But I didn't view them as in the way I did. Later, I got to know the Russians a bit, and they were different. But the Chinese, they're very deep people. Russia is only a country of 200 or 300 years. China's 5,000 years, and you can never get to grips with it. It's just vast, incredible. So I was bemused by the opposition, but I was aware from a very early stage that the Foreign Office wouldn't have much to do with us, that the DTIs, I think it's called the British Overseas Trade Board, all these organisations were very hostile to us. And I worked to bring what we did and what others did together. And that's why I formed CBBC, and I was chucked out of it by the Hongs. They're really bitter towards people with a sort of friendship attitude to each other.
Do you think your father's attitude to communism stems from firstly the anti-Semitism of
Yeah.
the Second World War, and then, as you say before, what Russia. But really, it wasn't a belief that he wanted to turn anybody else
Sorry.
communist. He thought it was just, this is, you know, this is, I would rather stand by these people because the establishment is a very nasty, powerful, and it still is now. We haven't actually managed to.
I think
More and more people are saying
yeah,
nowadays it's becoming ridiculous how many poor people we have.
yeah. My father in the 30s, it was about safety, protection from anti-Semitism. By the time the 40s came along, he had a deep understanding. I would imagine he was very involved with organizations that the protests. I know he did a sit-in at the Savoy Hotel, protesting about how the rich were able to have great meals and the poor didn't have enough food. And I'm sure he became very clear about what was then the Marxist approach, which was capitalism versus socialism. I mean, that's the great change that China's made. It views socialism as a development of capitalism. But in those days, it was about good and bad, right and wrong. And that was in large part created by the Americans, who decided to have a Cold War to try and isolate and stop the spread of communism. You know, I talked with a friend of mine in Cambridge, a professor in Cambridge recently, and I said, why is it that there is this history of hostility between capitalism and socialism? Was Marx a believer that capitalism had to be overthrown? And he said, no, essentially Marx was a believer in evolution, that systems evolve one into the other. But it's not how he wrote. He wrote in a very aggressive form. And so a lot of people on the left have taken up the idea that the only way you can make socialism is by smashing capitalism. It's not really what Marx believed. He said to me, I don't know, I've not read it. And he said, therefore, the opposite exists. So the belief was there that what the United States was doing together with the rest of the West was trying to demolish communism, demolish the Russian state, the Soviet state, and carry on doing that. And the belief they have is that the West armed Hitler in order to attack Russia. And Stalin was too alert and formed a temporary peace in order to, he said, Russia's got 10 years to build a military to defend itself against the Germans. They're going to come and get us. And of course, it was during the middle of the Battle of Britain that the Nazis changed from attacking Britain to attacking Russia. But before then, they'd demolished Europe. So a lot of things are in the minds of the left-wing people. The right have the CIA and all of that structure to demolish communists, socialists, as being people that are, you know, like the red squirrel and the grey squirrel. You know, you die or you'll be eaten. And that was quite prevalent as well in I guess in the Russian and Soviet thinking. The Chinese didn't accept, they didn't say they didn't believe it, but they didn't say they did believe it. But if you look at what China has done since, in my opinion, Zhou Enlai took charge of the major road forwards of China, was that socialism does define what we believe in as a people, which is about sharing. It's about building a country, improving our country, but we must do it with a principle of sharing. But they weren't people whose preoccupation was with smashing capitalism. One of the reasons was they had very little capitalism in China. They had feudalism. And the Chinese moved, not very clear to us as outsiders, but if you ask the question, why did the Cultural Revolution happen? It's because Mao knew that the prevalent view in China, which came to be done from 1978 onwards, was to remove the peasantry. The peasant class was evidence of feudalism, was evidence of poverty, and you wouldn't be able to transform China and produce the food and everything else that was needed for a proper life for the people unless the peasant class was removed and moved to manufacturing and service industries, the natural development of capitalism, in other words. So they didn't say we're going to produce capitalism, they said we're going to produce what we believe in, which is socialism, and fairly early on in the development, and I'm going off the subject that you're asking, but fairly early on in their thinking through, it's obvious to me, in the early 60s, they understood that they wouldn't be able to produce socialism without having capitalism. So some people said you can't have socialism without having capitalism. The Chinese Communist Party came to the opinion you can have socialism and capitalism together. And you just have to manage capitalism. And of course, what Xi Jinping came in with the mandate was that capitalism had got out of control. It had become too big, too powerful, too corrupt. And his job was to make it, although it's the majority of the economy, to make it much more contained and controlled. So there's still capitalism in China, but it's not anywhere near as powerful as it was getting by 2012. So my father understood all of this. He went through the period of being, for the revolution and all of that, because that's what was going on around him. But he had lost all of that. When I used to talk to my father, he talked bitterly about the Vietnam War and about what the West was involved in with imperialism and colonialism. I learned a lot of that from him. But he was not a man who believed in violence and fighting. But he was a man who believed that the system we had in Britain of capitalism was too raw, too selfish, too greedy. But he didn't join the Labour Party. He didn't involve himself in British politics. He didn't see any point. The working class of Britain had turned away from that type of transformation to socialism in the 1920s. They hadn't bought into the Bolshevik alternatives. And he was just busy doing his business. So he was very intellectually developed. People from all around the world could sit and talk with him and hear him explain how the different nations came together. But he was clear that the Russians had lost it by the early 60s, that they had become as obsessed with power and military to the extent that they couldn't practice a concept of socialism.
You once said that the Cold War was started deliberately to get Russia to build tanks rather than tractors.
Yeah.
Because communism, if it's done properly, which China is doing now, which is a proper share, making money, but sharing it in a more fair fashion.
Yeah.
That's Western capitalism, which we're seeing now, this neo-capitalism, which is where you're making profit almost as an algorithm for the sake of making profit, and to hell with any of the consequences on humanity.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, the capitalism has no link back to the standards of living of the ordinary people. And that's because the welfare state that was produced as a compromise between the needs of the people and the capitalist system took the money by taxation to reduce the health and other welfare things. If it had taken it from the company profits, there would have been far less clash of interests between the people and the system. And that's what China's doing. It's taking the dividends of capitalism and using them for the benefits of the people. So the people don't feel separated from the process of capitalism. All these big companies that Jack Ma have created, they've all created huge funds for charitable purposes. I mean, 2/3 of their profits are now in funds being given to poor areas, poor people, all sorts of social goodwill. So the Chinese are taking capitalism and saying, we've got to take out of it the features that produce a conflict with the people. And one of the main ones is to make the dividend flows mainly for the benefit of the people.
Isn't that a corporation tax?
Sorry?
Isn't that corporation tax? You don't get tax in this country unless you make a profit.
No, it's so the companies are responsible for providing the health for their people, for their employees. So funds are created for providing for the health of the people. Those funds buy insurance policies for the benefit of their people. The top people in the companies are told, this is your responsibility to look after the health of your people. So don't tell us you went to the wrong insurance company or you didn't get the right cover. You have got to have a social conscience. What kind of social preoccupation for the health and welfare and pensions of its employees do most captains of industry have? It's not what they're asked to do. They're given huge bonuses for profit, not for welfare. The Chinese system is different. It's pointing the people who are in the leadership at looking after the welfare of their people, of their employees. For those who are not employed or disabled or whatever, there are separate funds, and they're getting their income from the state-owned enterprises. The whole system is entirely different from ours, but it's based on capitalism, but it's based on a remodeled capitalism, and that's what people here don't want to understand. They don't want to look at what China is doing. I think China is the greatest source of modelling for reforming capitalism. We don't have to become socialists. We can stay capitalists, but we've got to solve the problem of inequality. We've got to solve the problem of education. All of it's about inequality and making sure that the right resources are there. The argument against it is that if you give people too much, they won't work. You go to China, they're working.
But going back
Sorry.
to you, do you think that the hatred or the policy towards you and your family is based on the fact that you're a Westerner who does follow the Chinese way, and says, yeah, if you want to make money, you can make money in China. There's no problem with doing that. Look, we've done it. We help China make money. Our family has done it. So you're more of a threat because you don't want to smash capitalism. You've actually said, we're doing better capitalism than you lot.
The Chinese are doing better capitalism. They're on their way. They're well on their way to that. Yes. No, I think. No, I think there are companies who felt an enormous threat from China in the late 40s, early 50s, who lost a lot of assets in China and felt that people like us came along and exploited the gap that they left and that we were bad people. I think that's a mistaken view. I think it gets mixed up with anti-Semitism that exists in Britain. I've experienced it myself from some of those people. But they are victims of their environment in the same way as I'm a victim of my environment. I don't hate any of them. I'd sit and be with those people the same as any other people. But they have a tremendous desire to push people like me out the way and to control the corridor between Britain and China because they've got an enormous amount invested in Hong Kong. And they want the Chinese to look to them to solve their problems and for them to be the conduit. They don't want people like us in there. So they dislike us because we're in the way, and they dislike us because they think that we like communists. They don't understand what the word means. They don't understand what a Chinese communist is. Of course, the Communist Party of China is incredibly democratic. It consults much more than anybody here does, and it consults much more than anybody here realizes. But their system is one where when they're forming policy, there's a very broad sourcing of inputs for it. And people are not chosen for their inputs depending upon their seniority. Seniority has a significant part, but anybody can speak if they're in the area where the matter is being discussed. But once the decision is made of what to do, don't fight it. If you fight the decision of what to do, you may very well lose your human rights of political organization and of freedom of speech because you're seen as subverting the state. Now, I don't go around trying to subvert the British state. I disagree with the way we do things with China, but I don't make a big thing of it. I say, if you want any help from me, I'm here and I'm available. what people resent about me, and they resented it about my father, was the Chinese will listen to us more than most. And what will they listen to us about? They won't listen to us about how to achieve things with the British government. They know that we can't deliver policies in Britain. We don't have that kind of influence. But we can explain why the British are concerned. So let me give you an example. In about 2007, a man I've known for many years was in quite a senior position, came to London. The Chinese ambassador wouldn't arrange for me to meet him. She was as hostile to me as some of these Hongs are, because she didn't like somebody who was out of her system, in the same way as people in the British Foreign Office and so on don't like people who are out of the control of the British system having a major role to play and being listened to. So she wouldn't let me meet him, but his secretary rang me and asked me if I'd go to his hotel, and it's nice to see you, Stephen, and so on and so forth, have some fruit, some tea. Stephen, do you think that what is going on with the British and Iraq? So I thought to myself, you know what's going on. So I said to him, well, it's about the special relationship, and when America goes to war, Britain tends to go. He said, no. And then he said to me, you could have knocked me off with a with a feather. He said to me, can we have a special relationship with Britain? I said, you're serious, aren't you? He said, yes. Now, this is what came to pass about 7 years later. This was part of their preparation, the scientific method. He had come to ask me what I thought about their intention to try and create a special relationship with the British, which happened with George Osborne and David Cameron. And I said to him, I need a moment or two to think about this. And I went through a number of things in my mind. And I said to him, you know, the special relationship between Britain and America is very deep. It operates at various levels of society, various levels of business, various levels of politics. You don't stand a chance of undermining that. It's too powerful. But what the British need is economic help, and that takes the form of wanting exports to China, but it also takes the form of wanting investment from China, wanting you to use London as the major financial centre and things like that. So if you give the British what they want, then they will have a relationship with you, but it'll be an economic relationship, not a political relationship. If you try and replace the Americans as the ally or the political ally of the United Kingdom, the Americans will drive you out. And of course they made the mistake. Is your card in trouble? Sorry?